creation story is a good example, as scientists have effectively been motivated by it to try and make scientific sense of the universe. When viewed in this way, if no one believed in God, then perhaps fewer people would be inclined to ponder life's biggest questions in the first place. We can see the long-lasting impact of theistic religions in general culture as well. They've often served to preserve our knowledge of the ancient world, recording it via scripture, sculpture, and art, as well as simply by the telling of stories, usually in languages such as Latin that are or were in some way influenced by our religions. Much of what we know about ancient Greece, for example, has been carried through history thanks to Islamic translations. Belief in various gods has also inspired centuries of music, with traditional songs going on to influence and shape various contemporary genres, from gospel to country and rock and roll. Perhaps paintings and sculptures are the art forms most obviously linked to a belief in God, though. Much of Western art from the Middle Ages through to the Renaissance was shaped by religion, with artists trying to capture the divine and extraordinary. Without belief in some form of higher power, even millennia-old cave paintings might have looked different, with the history of art now firmly, perhaps exclusively aiming for realism. For a more contemporary effect, even modern world movies and television would cater for a different audience. For instance, without the backdrop of mythological gods, heroes, and monsters, perhaps the superhero genre would never have taken off quite so spectacularly. Architecture is another creative pursuit that would have no doubt developed differently. We'd likely never have had hundreds of thousands of religious buildings like churches, mosques, and synagogues, and therefore we'd never have learned the various building techniques that creating these structures demanded of us. Or at least we'd have learnt them at a slower rate. Westminster Abbey, the Pyramids of Giza, Vatican City, we'd never have seen any of them, given how they're all built in some way upon a belief in God, divinity, or the afterlife. The primary human need for shelter would still of course be there, and the wealthiest among us may still have preferred our homes to look in some way beautiful, but places of worship they'd no longer be. It'd be part of a general psychological shift, wherein we'd all be answerable to only ourselves, with no godly teachings to sway our actions. Without God, there'd be no traditional concept of heaven either, while we'd also lose one significant line of argument when even trying to determine the meaning of life. On the other hand, it's often suggested that humanity's belief in various gods can bring about division, intolerance, and war. So while we could still see violence for other reasons, without anybody believing in any god, we'd perhaps see much less by way of religious persecution. In general, the overriding concept of religion may still have come about though, even without belief in any actual gods. Sure, we wouldn't see any theistic faiths, but we could still see wide-reaching social groups defined by other belief systems, teachings, and traditions. A religion might instead celebrate nature or the human spirit rather than deities, while religious texts would primarily focus on life lessons, rules, and human wisdom. In this way, we'd still see the emergence of religiously influenced laws and legislation, only something like the Ten Commandments would never have been issued by God. And so it's perhaps unlikely that such a religion could avoid a hierarchy altogether, as leaders and preachers would still attract followers. Humanity may well have developed its moral code by some other means, without the guiding light of a god to show the way. But if you subscribe to Voltaire's philosophy that if God did not exist, we would have to invent him, then even a godless society would wind up creating some kind of supreme being. All in all, it'd clearly be a very different world, one without faith and without the various theistic influences that today appear all across the planet. But life's seemingly unanswerable questions would still require us to at least try to figure them out. And that's what would happen if no one believed in God.
Can we prove that God exists? Well, it kind of depends what we mean by proof. True proof only exists in maths. I can 100% prove to you that 2 + 2 is always going to equal 4, but even scientists need a certain amount of faith. In order to even do science, they have to believe that there's an order to the world, that things will react in a certain way because forces like gravity are at work. Proof in science is similar to a law court. Lawyers speak of proof beyond reasonable doubt. They can't mathematically prove that someone did the crime, but they can build up a case using things like confession, eyewitnesses, and documentary evidence. And it's this type of proof that I think we can offer when it comes to God. So here are some of those arguments or proofs, if you will. The argument from morality. The idea that we have an inbuilt sense of right and wrong. That we have an instinctive sense, for example, that rape is always wrong. This points us to a law inside of us, which in turn points to a lawgiver, someone outside of ourselves who's put that law inside us. Then the aesthetic argument, which is basically just a fancy word for the idea that art and beauty point to something outside of us. A character in a book called Chasing Francis, about a church pastor who loses his faith, says this: "The object of all great art is beauty, and it makes us nostalgic for God." Francis Collins, who's one of the world's leading scientists, used to be an atheist, and the thing that finally convinced him that God existed was looking at a beautiful frozen waterfall. Then you've got the argument from desire. The feeling that there's more to life than this points to the fact that we don't belong here. C.S. Lewis said, "If I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world." Then we've got the argument from cosmology, another fancy word which comes from the Greek for world, cosmos, and study, logios. The fact that the existence of the universe points to the existence of a God who created it. When scientists began to talk about the Big Bang theory in the early 1930s, atheists tried to get rid of that theory because it supported the Christian idea that the universe had a beginning. And if the universe had a beginning, then something or someone must have kick-started that process. Then you've got the argument from design. Even atheist scientists talk about the universe being finely tuned. If a tiny change was made in something like the gases in the air or how close the Earth is to the sun, then life would be impossible. Is everything perfectly in balance because of chance? Or could it be that someone has put it all together, someone's finely tuned it? And look at how complicated humans are. Could this maybe point to a God who designed us? Isaac Newton said, "In the absence of any other proof, the thumb alone would convince me of God's existence." Then you've got the argument for resurrection. This needs a whole other video, but if Jesus really rose from the dead, then this shows that he must have been God. And finally, what I think is one of the most important arguments, one of the most important proofs, is the argument from personal experience. Ask any Christian how they know that God exists, and they will have their own unique story that they can share with you. At the end of the day, it's up to you to decide if any of these proofs hold up in a court of law, and whether you think they're worth putting your faith in.